always about fun. Some people find meditation intimidating. It really isn't. Yeah, come on up. But we need to put it to where I'm not going to knock it over because I tend to flail when I talk.
Is this good?
Are we good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When you did that meditation, you were engaging your power of imagination. And I'm going to start my talk this morning by reminding you of that. Because what we're going to talk about is imagining scenarios. So imagine that you are standing in front of a great artist's work. The natural question that we ask ourselves often is, what does it mean? So I'm going to use for an example Van Gogh's Starry Night. Okay, are we all familiar with that one with the blue and the yellow swirlies and stuff like that? When I look at that, I see vibrations. I see things vibrating. It seems almost like it's alive. But then I wonder, what did the artist see? What did the artist intend? Did he see those vibrations coming out from that canvas and affecting the people who were looking at it? Or was his vision set on the splendor of natural energy? And he never even took into account the people who were going to look at his painting. Was he theistic? Was he atheistic? Was he inspired by the fullness of life? Or maybe for Van Gogh, the emptiness of it all? Maybe both? Maybe neither? Maybe a third option? See, the nature of art is about interpretation. And the craft of the fine artist is not formula, but vision. And every vision, in order for it to be effective, must engage other people, must engage the audience. Whether it's an individual, a community, a nation, a world, in its meaning. So it's pointless to kind of ask whether what Van Gogh saw in that painting actually really exists. It's the wrong question, because of course it does, and of course it doesn't. We might not see it, but it might have been very real in the eye of the artist. It's a vision, and as such it exists and it has a reality. Same thing with a poet. Poets write in symbolic language. They play out a kind of imaginative game with words and rhyme, painting pictures, using words that force us to look at things differently. It has a fullness to it and yet a kind of emptiness, especially if we read a poem that doesn't speak to us. It doesn't make the poem any less valid. There are just some words that speak to us better than others. Because you see, the poem is never really about the poem. The poem is about the experience of the poem. What emotions does it bring up in you? What things does it remind you of? I know that there are some people, for instance, who, if they see poetry that doesn't rhyme, they don't think it's poetry. And that's a reaction. Maybe not one that the poet intended, but it's a reaction nevertheless. But it's all about bringing forth images that the poet wants to communicate and needs to get behind the ordinary words that we use to describe things. And yet poems are not really there. They're not objects. They're just collections of words. But a poem, like a painting, exists in a very important way, because it brings literalism to life and engages our imaginations. Because a poem and an important painting, or really any painting if you're an artist, awakens the imagination. And imagination is something that we live. It's not something that we have, it's something that we live. And so it is with the Easter experience. The resurrection of the mystery and the life of the person that we celebrate today. Because in unity, resurrection is not the resuscitation of a physical body. And I know that that's hard for some people to hear, but It's the realization. It is a realization of the ongoingness of life, of the spirit energy that we know, we see in the springtime. We feel it in the greening of the earth, the blooming of trees, the budding of flowers. All of that energy speaks to us of the ongoingness of life. Even when 2 months ago the grass looked like it was dead, the trees had no leaves, the flowers hadn't broken through the earth yet. I mean, I remember coming from the Northeast that day when we would see crocuses coming through snow. I was like, yes, it's going to be spring again soon. Yes, winter's going to be over soon. So resurrection takes place in us every time we rise to the realization that there is a perpetual indwelling energy in us that connects us to that vital force of the universe. And that flood, and it feels like a flood, that flow of life, do you ever look, when you're driving around, it's almost a little late now, but at the beginning of spring, when you can see that light green color, that sort of hazy green color, and you know that pretty soon it's going to go. It's that energy, that life force, and that energy is available to us. And the truth of it is that resurrection always follows crucifixion. Nobody, nothing that is alive escapes the process. The Easter story is about an old way of being that is crucified so that something new can be born. And this is not like the daily words of today. This is not a once-in-a-lifetime event. When somebody experiences divorce, the death of a partner, the loss of a job, a shift in your external circumstances, maybe some financial challenges, your old identity dies so that a new one can be born. And I remember the first time I lost a job, and I went, my husband and I worked since I was 13. Okay, so I had never really been without a job. And he said to me, why don't you just take some time and just like veg for a little bit and just kind of take some time off. And we went somewhere and we were filling out paperwork for something. I don't remember whether it was a car title or whatever. And the woman behind the desk, when she said, what do you do? And I said, I don't work. Who's your employer? I said, I don't work. And what she filled in there was housewife. And there was something inside of me that went, ugh. Not because I thought being a housewife was a bad thing, but it's like somebody assigned an identity to me that I wasn't prepared yet to assume out of the change that I felt like I had no control over. Over the centuries, various responses to the question of the whole idea of resurrection, of Jesus the man, has divided Christians into lots of different camps, and everybody's sort of working out their own individual response to it, and unity is no different. So for atheists and agnostics and people of other religions, the physical resuscitation of Jesus' body is simply out of the question because it lies beyond reason. And there are very many Christians for whom the actual physical resuscitation of Jesus' physical body is a moot point. The entire argument for them is really irrelevant. And yet we know, for some people, it's the center of their belief system. So the question of whether or not we believe in the resurrection hangs in the air. It's almost like an unwelcome smell. It's there, and we Christians deal with it. And it's a smell that's made all the more pungent by our 21st century sensibilities. The idea that a dead man came back to life some 2,000 years ago is simply too much for some of our 21st century minds to accept, just because. So while a good many sermons are going to be preached this morning about the resurrection of a body, And those sermons are going to declare that Jesus physically rose from the dead. The Bible itself is much less clear on the details of the resurrection. To ask the question whether or not the resurrection is true, and to mean by that only a resuscitated corpse constitutes proof, is to impose the standards of a modern mind on a pre-scientific culture that lived in myth and magic. See, the dualism of body and soul that is very much a Greek idea and one that we live with as 21st century Westerners, for the Jews, it was irrelevant because they didn't separate out those two things. I mean, they had no concept in the framework in which they lived and operated that those two things were separate. After all, how could you rise if you didn't have a body to rise in? What did that mean? And what we refer to as the soul was a foreign concept to first century Jews. It's still foreign to some people who follow the Jewish tradition today. People who are Reformed Jews and who have an element of the Greek tradition in their belief framework kind of separate that out. But Orthodox Jews and people who are observant Jews from a biblical standpoint still don't make that distinction. And so the question about what kind of a body the risen Christ had would have been for first century Jews a really stupid question. It is possible that something that our 21st century minds would describe as something really deeply spiritual happened. But that something was not the resuscitation of a corpse. Because the supernatural resuscitation of a corpse not only violates the laws of science, it's also difficult to reconcile physical resuscitation with the details that are recorded in the scriptures. What if, and here's your power of imagination, what if the experience of Jesus was one in which his followers saw the power of the divine in this man to an extent that they had never encountered it before? What if? If we see some universal divine force, divine energy as the ground of our being, then Jesus can be viewed as a unique, but not solo, human man, in who this ground of being was not a distant source of existence. He lived it every single day. It wasn't buried under layers of ego, like ours is on occasion, but it was the very center of his being. It was the energy from which he operated. And so after the human Jesus died, what if his followers continued to experience the power of his love? The power of love that they had seen in Jesus continued on with them, even though their teacher was no longer with them. I can tell you a story. It's a personal story for me, but I lost my husband to COVID. And he was in intensive care for 31 days. And I didn't get to see him. Nobody got to visit. And I got a call, and we made the decision that it was time to unplug all of the equipment because he wasn't going to ever recover, and that's what he would have wanted. And so I went down to the medical center. I couldn't bring anybody with me. I had to be by myself. They let me in. We disconnected it. And as I was riding up the elevator to see him, my parents have been dead for going on 10 years now. My mother and dad lived into their 90s. They had beautiful, full, healthy lives. But I missed them every day. And as I was riding up in the elevator, it was like, okay, Mom and Dad, I need you now. I need you to have my back. I need you to hold me because I'm not sure I'm going to be strong enough to do this. Anyway, it happened. I came hours later back on the elevator, And I lost it in the elevator. As a matter of fact, when I got to the bottom, I was sitting I was sitting on the floor to where the guy who was behind the desk was like, do I have to call EMS? Poor man didn't know what to do. And I said, no, I'm fine. And I got up, and my father's favorite song was Pennies from Heaven. And he used to sing it. He had no voice, but he sang it all of the time. And he always used to tell us, don't ever walk by a penny. If you see a penny, pick it up, because that means an angel's talking to you. Well, I'm down at the medical center. I'm in front of Memorial Hermann, so lots of traffic, lots of people, lots of doctors. I walk out the door, and right in the middle of the sidewalk, right in front of me, facing each other, were two brand new shiny pennies. I don't know what that meant. I know what it meant to me. I don't know how they got there. I mean, it looked like they were put there. That's the experience. Because at that point, I knew my parents' love was with me. It was strengthening me. It was going to allow me to walk through this craziness that I was dealing with and allow me to move forward. So we continue to experience, in a very mystical and metaphysical way, the presence of love in our lives. And this is what the Bible story is trying to communicate. So when we examine the story of Jesus' death and the mystical experience of resurrection, that mystical experience of knowing that he was there with them, even though he wasn't there with them, we can see the very human nature of Jesus, right? That crucifixion is something we all go through. We have to go through crucifixions to get to resurrection. We have to open our heart almost, there's a saying that says, God enters us through the broken places. So when we're broken, part of what allows that shell that we think is our body and our ego, when that breaks is when we allow the God within to come out. That's how it happens. And so we can choose to call it, I choose to call it a crucifixion moment. I mean, we've all done it. We've all been there. We don't get to be you're young yet. We don't get to be our ages and not have had experience of that. Yet, in the resurrection story, in the Bible story, we learn that this human condition is not a conclusion. It's not the end. Because behind suffering lives power. The power of existence, the power of life that is eternal, that you can't kill. It's an energy that we can transform. That's a law of physics. You can't kill energy. You can't eliminate energy. You can transform it. It can change how it shows up, but you can never destroy energy. And that's what we see after crucifixion in our own lives. The energy that is us gets crucified, stuff happens to us, we come out, and we have a resurrection experience. We come to know that we have what it takes to go on. And sometimes it requires each other to remind us when we forget. That's the whole point of a church family, is to hold the space for you when you forgot who you are. And I know they do other things like volunteer and stuff like that, but that's really the role of a church family. So Easter in the Unity tradition is not just about the resurrection of Jesus or the hope that we're going to be resurrected when our time comes, when we die, and when this of us is it leaves this mortal plane. Because the good news about Easter is that it's not limited to Jesus. And resurrection is not limited to life after death. And I know that that's hard for some people. This may be the first time you're ever hearing that, and I'll leave you my phone number if you need to talk about it. But that's a hard thing to get, because resurrection happens through creation. It's the other side of it. Okay, resurrection is that burst that comes in nature that says, pretty soon this tree is going to be all green. Or this brown grass is going to be all green. Or that tulip. Think about the struggle that a flower and a seed has to get out from underneath all the stuff that's on the ground. And yet it happens. That's what life energy is about. And metaphysically, resurrection is about our power to overcome, our power to restore, our power to renew, our power to heal, our power to bring peace, our power to love. It's about prosperity. It's about joy. It's about anything that we're trying to revive in our life. And sometimes it's about reviving our sense of ourselves. Who am I? And how am I going to show up in the world? So for those who are in poor health, regaining your health is a resurrection. For people experience resurrection when their relationship and their financial problems finally get settled, finally get resolved. Anytime we explore new ideas and new possibilities, we are inviting that experience of resurrection. So the Easter experience here is not a passport to another world. It's not going to take you where everything is fine and dandy and angels are singing and it's going to be all sparkly. It's a quality of perception in this one, much like the artist and the poet I talked about in the beginning. Have a vision for what you want your resurrection experience to be, because it is an insight into our own potential. And it is what allows us to overcome. It's what allows us to have possibilities in our lives. Because the miracle of Easter is not about the resurrection of Jesus. It's a reminder of our power of resurrection, our power to move forward. So if the rumors about the empty tomb are to be believed, we are not to look for the living among the dead. Hi there. Happy Easter. He stops by every time I'm here. Yeah. If Jesus has left the tomb, the man's out of the tomb, and we are to follow him, we have to leave our tombs behind. That's scary. To follow, I'm going to say to follow, but not worship Jesus, we'll have to leave the old trappings behind. Just like the shabby grave clothes that the scriptures tell us Jesus left behind. Right? When they went into the tomb was empty, but the clothes were on the bench. Okay? If we are to live in the light, we've got to leave those clothes behind. And that's not an easy calling. That's not something that's easy to do. We have to be prepared to be surprised by what shows up, by the people and the circumstances that shows up. If we show up with an open heart, a loving heart, an open mind, those opportunities will present. And they may show up in a way we never imagined they would. We could have never imagined it, but they're there. And maybe they've been there all along, but we just haven't engaged our imagination to the extent that allowed us to see them. We have to allow other people in our world, including those people that we've decided to write off, to influence us, to allow us to come through that open heart. Because the people who experienced Jesus the man experienced love in a culture-shattering way. So mind-blowing that their lives will never be the same. They were never the same again. And we have that opportunity. That love had the power to raise them from their own tombs, just like it has the power to raise us from our own tombs. And in order to do that, one of the first things we have to do is move away the rock. So that scripture to me has a significant meaning. The part of scripture that talks about how the stone got moved away. And there's another parable. It's an Eastern parable, but not a Jesus parable, about creatures who lived at the bottom of a river. And these creatures, that was their universe, that was their world, and they held on to rocks till they were bloodied. I mean, they were holding on to those rocks, and the tides would come in and they would get battered around, but they knew those rocks, and they were holding on to those rocks. And then one person just had it. One of the creatures just said, you know what, I'm done. And he let go. And he bobbed to the top of the river. It was bright and sunny, and the river carried him along with no effort, and then deposited him on this beautiful white beach. And he spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how to tell the people at the bottom of the river, how to tell those creatures at the bottom of the river, let go of the damn rocks. Well, I am a cling to the rock kind of person. I was raised very conservatively. I was educated very conservatively, and I've worked my entire life. And I have rocks all over my house. I have a rock in my car. I have rocks in my kitchen. They're on my countertop. They're in my bathroom, on the dresser. They're everywhere. Because I have to constantly remind myself to let go of the rock, to let go of this, to move the stone aside. In order to have a resurrection experience, I have to move the stone. Didn't see Jesus came through the stone. So Jesus had the stone was removed. Something, someone, Jesus himself, I don't know, something moved the stone. And in that movement, it allowed the energy that was there to come out and create and be something new. Because, here's something to think about. The who of you dies, but the what of you is eternal. The who that is your personality, the who that is Vita, the who that is Marcia, that's going to die. But the what of us is going to go on forever. It's that energy, and because energy is never destroyed. Like I said before, it changes form, but it never gets destroyed. And oftentimes how it manifests is in the power of love. Now, I'm not talking about gushy, squeezy, romantic love. I'm not talking about that kind of love. But love that leads to action. Love that leads to openness. Love that leads to vulnerability. Love that leads to welcoming new possibilities, even when you don't know what those possibilities are going to be. That power lives inside of us. And our job is to move away that stone, stand up, get rid of those clothes, shed those grave cloths like Jesus did and left behind. Because we need to know that that power lives and breathes and has its being in, with, and through us every day. So on this Easter Sunday, I wish you a continual glorious resurrection and know that it's a great adventure and that your imagination will allow you to see the truth in it. So thank you and namaste. Okay, everybody breathe.